March the 22nd, 1945. The Rhine River, Germany's last natural defensive barrier, a liquid fortress that had protected the German heartland for centuries. Allied planners estimated it would take weeks of preparation, thousands of casualties, and massive artillery support to force a crossing. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had been planning his elaborate Rhine crossing for months, assembling the largest amphibious operation since D-Day, scheduled for March 24th. Then George S. Patton did the impossible. In less than 24 hours, without fanfare, without the massive buildup, without even informing Supreme Headquarters, Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim. When word reached Winston Churchill in London, the Prime Minister's reaction was not what anyone expected. What he said in that moment would reveal everything about leadership, rivalry, and the brutal mathematics of war. This is the story of how one general's audacity changed the endgame of World War II, and what the most powerful man in Britain said when he learned about it. You won't find these stories anywhere else. Subscribe now and never miss a new video. And drop a comment below what fascinates you most about Patton's Rhine crossing, or simply tell us where in the world you're watching from. By March 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final act, but the Rhine remained unconquered. Hitler had declared it would be Germany's moat, ordering every bridge destroyed, every crossing point fortified. The river itself was a formidable obstacle, nearly 1,500 feet wide at many points, with currents reaching 6 knots, cold enough to kill a man in minutes. Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower had approved Montgomery's Operation Plunder, a massive set-piece assault scheduled to begin on March 24th. Montgomery, meticulous to a fault, had assembled 25 divisions, 37,000 vehicles, and enough supplies to fill multiple freight trains. He'd even brought Churchill to observe what he promised would be the war's final great triumph. The preparations were so elaborate that one American officer quipped, "If Monty crosses the Rhine, he'll do it with such ceremony that the Germans will have time to send engraved invitations to their own defeat." But 200 miles south, George S. Patton was thinking differently. Patton's Third Army had been racing across France and Germany with a speed that defied military logic. His corps commanders, men like John Milliken and Manton Eddy, had learned to think like their general, fast, aggressive, always moving. On March 21st, as his forces approached the Rhine near the town of Oppenheim, Patton saw his opportunity. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oscar Koch, brought him the reconnaissance reports. "General, the West Bank is lightly defended. Bridge demolitions have left gaps in their defenses. The town of Oppenheim has minimal garrison strength, maybe 200 infantry, no armor." Patton didn't hesitate. "Get me Eddy." Major General Manton Eddy, commanding Nautilus Corps, received the call at 10:47 p.m. on March 21st. Patton's voice crackled through the field telephone. "Manton, you're going across tonight. No delays, no elaborate preparations. Use whatever boats you have. I want a regiment on the East Bank by dawn." Eddy, a cerebral officer who balanced Patton's aggression with careful planning, understood immediately. "We have assault boats from the engineers. The 5th Infantry Division is closest. They can lead." "Then get them moving," Patton snapped. "And Eddy, not a word to Schaff. We're crossing first, explaining later." This was vintage Patton, operating on the edge of insubordination, driven by an almost supernatural competitive instinct. His chief of staff, Hobart Gay, later wrote in his diary, "The general paced like a caged tiger. He kept saying, 'Montgomery wants the glory. He wants to be the first across.' Well, we'll see about that." The 5th Infantry Division, commanded by Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin, began moving toward Oppenheim at midnight. The soldiers, many of them combat veterans since Normandy, knew something unusual was happening. Sergeant Warren Eames of the 11th Infantry Regiment later recalled, "We got the word around Zuro's 100 hours. Light march, assault boats, move quiet." The officers looked excited but also nervous. Nobody said it out loud, but we knew we were going for the Rhine. The approach march was conducted in near total darkness. Patton had ordered minimal vehicle movement to avoid alerting German reconnaissance. The infantry moved on foot, carrying their assault boats, unwieldy canvas and plywood craft that weighed 450 pounds each. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ewell, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 11th Infantry, later described the scene. The men were exhausted before we even reached the river, but there was this electricity in the air. Everyone knew we were about to do something historic. At 10:30 p.m. on March 22nd, the first assault wave hit the water. The Rhine at Oppenheim was approximately 1,000 feet wide, flowing at nearly 4 knots. The night was dark. A new moon provided minimal illumination. This was both blessing and curse. Darkness concealed the Americans, but it also made navigation treacherous. The engineers had marked the crossing points with subdued lights on the west bank, but the east bank was pure guesswork. Private First Class Donald Jones was in the 3rd boat of the first wave. In a 1983 interview he remembered, "The boat was packed, 12 of us plus the engineer driving. The water was freezing. Every time we hit a wave, spray came over the side. I remember thinking, if Germans open up now, we're all dead." But we kept paddling. The current wanted to take us downstream, but our guy kept us pointed at that dark shore. The crossing took 11 minutes, an eternity under fire, but miraculously the first boats landed unopposed. The German defenders, undermanned and demoralized, had not expected an assault at this location. Their attention was focused on Montgomery's obvious preparations to the north. By 11:15 p.m., 2 companies of the 11th Infantry Regiment were ashore. Lieutenant Donald Critchfield, leading the 2nd Platoon of Company E, later described the moment. "We hit the beach. It was really just a muddy slope and fanned out. Still no contact. I remember thinking, where are they?" Then we heard German voices about 200 yards inland, but they weren't alarmed. They were just talking, maybe smoking. They had no idea we were there. The initial bridgehead was secured with minimal resistance. By midnight, 8 companies were across, nearly 1,200 men. The Germans, when they finally realized what was happening, responded with scattered artillery fire, but it was too late. The Americans were already digging in. Back at 3rd Army headquarters in Idar Oberstein, Patton was monitoring radio reports with barely contained excitement. His aide, Colonel Charles Codman, noted the general was smoking incessantly, usually a sign of stress, but he was also smiling. When the report came through that the 1st Battalions were across without major casualties, he actually laughed out loud. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Montgomery's still filling sandbags and we're already in Germany's bedroom." By dawn on March 23rd, the 5th Infantry Division had 4,000 men across the Rhine. Engineers were already ferrying tanks and artillery using improvised rafts and captured barges. The bridgehead expanded rapidly. German counterattacks were disorganized and ineffective. At 7 a.m., Patton finally called Supreme Headquarters. The conversation with General Omar Bradley, commander of the 12th Army Group, became legendary. Bradley's operations officer answered first, and Patton's voice came through, crisp and gleeful. "Brad, for God's sake, tell the world we're across. We knocked down 33 Krauts today when they came after us. I want the world to know 3rd Army made it before Monty starts across." When Bradley came on the line, Patton was even more exuberant. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley, confused, asked, "Across what?" Patton replied, "The Rhine, Brad. I sneaked a division over last night, but there are so few Krauts around they don't know it yet. So don't make any announcement. We'll keep it a secret until we see how it goes." Bradley later wrote in his memoir, "I was dumbfounded. George had crossed the Rhine with less preparation than we'd put into crossing the Seine, and he wanted to keep it quiet. That's when I realized this was as much about beating Montgomery as defeating Germans." But word spread quickly. By mid-morning, Eisenhower knew. His reaction was measured, publicly supportive, privately irritated by Patton's cowboy theatrics. His naval aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded in his diary, "Ike received the news with mixed feelings. He was pleased the crossing succeeded, but annoyed that Patton went ahead without clearance. He said, George couldn't have done this 6 months ago, but now with the Germans crumbling, he's made it look easy." The real test of reactions came from Churchill and Montgomery. Field Marshal Montgomery learned of Patton's crossing at 11:02 a.m. on March 23rd, just 13 hours before his own elaborately planned Operation Plunder was scheduled to begin. His Chief of Staff, Major General Francis Freddy de Guingand, brought him the intelligence report. Montgomery's response, recorded by multiple witnesses, was, "I see, I see. Patton has bounced the Rhine. How very American. Let us proceed with our operation as planned. We shall demonstrate the difference between a river crossing and a proper military operation." Montgomery's Operation Plunder began at midnight on March 23-24th, with a 4-hour artillery barrage involving 3,500 guns, the largest bombardment since El Alamein. The assault was methodical, overwhelming, and successful. Montgomery's meticulously planned operation lacked the one thing Patton had achieved: surprise and speed. Meanwhile, Winston Churchill was with Montgomery, having arrived to witness what was supposed to be Britain's crowning achievement in the European war. When news of Patton's crossing reached him, Churchill was having breakfast in Montgomery's command caravan. The moment was witnessed by Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, who recorded it in his diary. According to Brooke, Churchill was spreading marmalade on toast when an aide handed Montgomery a message, flimsy. Montgomery read it, his face hardening, then passed it to Churchill without comment. Churchill read the message, a terse report from Chef. Third Army crossed Rhine at Oppenheim, 22 to 30 hours, 22nd of March. Bridgehead secured, minimal casualties. Churchill set down his toast. For a long moment he said nothing. The tension in the caravan was palpable. Everyone knew what this meant for Montgomery's moment of glory. Then Churchill spoke, and his words were not what anyone expected. "Brilliant," Churchill said softly, then louder, "absolutely brilliant. That magnificent American cowboy has done it again." Montgomery stiffened. "Prime Minister, the operation was unauthorized and tactically unnecessary. We have—" Churchill cut him off with a wave of his hand. "Bernard, I know what we have. We have the most meticulously planned operation of the war. We have overwhelming force. We have guaranteed success. But what Patton has done, crossing the Rhine with assault boats and sheer audacity, this is the kind of warfare that wins wars quickly." He paused, then added with a slight smile, "And it rather makes our preparations look a bit elaborate, doesn't it?" The comment hung in the air. Churchill's private secretary, John Colville, later wrote that Montgomery looked as if he'd been slapped. But Churchill wasn't finished. He turned to Brooke and said something that revealed his deeper strategic thinking. "The Americans have given us a gift. Patton's crossing will draw German reserves south, away from Bernard's operation. Hitler will panic when he learns the Rhine has been breached at 2 points. This couldn't have worked out better if we'd planned it." This was Churchill at his finest, turning a potential embarrassment into a strategic advantage. But privately, in cables to Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden back in London, Churchill was more candid. In a message sent on March 24th, he wrote, "Patton has bounced the Rhine with typical American flair. While I believe Monty's operation will be more consequential, we must acknowledge that speed and audacity still have their place in modern warfare. The Americans have reminded us that wars are won not just by careful planning, but by the will to take calculated risks." Churchill's public statement, released to the press on March 25th, was even more generous. The crossing of the Rhine by American and British forces marks the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. General Patton's swift assault at Oppenheim and Field Marshal Montgomery's powerful operation in the north demonstrate the versatility and overwhelming strength of Allied arms. The enemy has nowhere left to hide. But what did Churchill say privately to Patton himself? This question has fascinated historians for decades, and the answer comes from multiple sources. Churchill and Patton met for the first time on March 26th, when Churchill visited the Third Army bridgehead. Patton, never one for false modesty, had prepared a show. He arranged for Churchill to actually walk across a newly constructed pontoon bridge over the Rhine. The scene was captured by army photographers. Churchill, wearing his familiar overcoat and holding a cigar, walked alongside Patton, who was in full dress uniform with his trademark ivory-handled pistols. As they reached the eastern bank, German territory, Churchill stopped and turned to Patton. According to Charles Codman, Patton's aide who was present, Churchill said, "General Patton, I have crossed many rivers in my life. I crossed the Nile as a young officer. I observed the Marne during the Great War. But this crossing, Hitler's Rhine, stepping onto German soil with the Wehrmacht in retreat. This is a moment I shall remember when all other memories have faded. Patton, typically brash and ready with a quip, was momentarily speechless. Then he replied, "Prime Minister, this river was supposed to stop us." Hitler said it was impassable. The German General Staff believed it would take months to breach. But Third Army crossed it in one night with canvas boats and determined men. That's what happens when you tell Americans something is impossible. They do it before breakfast. Churchill smiled, a genuine warm smile captured in the photographs. He said, "Quite right, General. Quite right. Never tell an American something cannot be done. They take it as a personal challenge." But the most revealing comment came afterward when Churchill was alone with his military secretary, General Hastings Ismay. According to Ismay's post-war memoirs, Churchill reflected on what Patton's achievement meant. "Ismay, that man, Patton, is insufferable, arrogant, insubordinate, politically tone-deaf. But my God, he can fight. When history is written, they'll remember that the Rhine, Hitler's Great Barrier, fell not to massive bombardments and elaborate plans, but to a general who simply decided it was time to cross and then did it. There's a lesson in that for all of us who have grown too cautious in our old age." The contrast between Montgomery's crossing and Patton's could not have been more stark. Montgomery's Operation Plunder involved 80,000 troops in the initial assault, supported by 1,000 artillery pieces and 1,500 aircraft. It was a masterpiece of planning and execution, with casualties kept remarkably low through overwhelming firepower. By any military metric, it was a textbook success. Patton's crossing involved 4,000 troops in the first 12 hours, supported by whatever artillery could be quickly moved forward. It succeeded through speed, surprise, and the exploitation of enemy weakness. Casualties in the initial crossing were less than 50 men, a remarkably low figure that shocked military analysts. The German reaction revealed which crossing they feared more. General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of staff, was interrogated after the war about the Rhine crossings. His testimony, preserved in U.S. Army archives, is illuminating. "When Montgomery crossed, we were prepared. We knew it was coming. We had positioned reserves and planned counterattacks. When Patton crossed at Oppenheim, this was a shock. We had minimal forces there because we never believed anyone would attempt a major crossing without extensive preparation. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late. The Americans were across in strength, and our ability to mount a coordinated defense was already compromised." Hitler's own reaction, recorded by his secretary Traudl Junge in her memoir, was apoplectic. The Führer was beside himself. He demanded to know how Patton had crossed so quickly. He accused his generals of incompetence, of treason. He kept saying, "One American general with boats made of canvas has achieved what Eisenhower said would take weeks." The general staff tried to assure him that Montgomery's crossing was the main threat, but Hitler was obsessed with Patton. He said, "That man is a demon. He doesn't fight like a soldier. He fights like a tiller." The strategic consequences were immediate and devastating for Germany. Patton's bridgehead expanded rapidly. Within 48 hours he had 2 full divisions across, more than 30,000 men. Within a week he was racing toward Frankfurt, encircling the Ruhr and cutting off German Army Group B. Montgomery's forces, crossing on a broader front, linked up with Patton's Third Army by March 28, creating an unstoppable Allied advance into the heart of Germany. But beyond the tactical success, Patton's Rhine crossing represented something deeper, a vindication of aggressive, mobile warfare in an age increasingly dominated by set-piece battles and overwhelming firepower. The U.S. Army's official history, written by Charles B. MacDonald, concluded, "Patton's assault crossing of the Rhine at Oppenheim stands as one of the finest examples of opportunistic warfare in modern military history. With minimal preparation and maximum audacity, Third Army achieved what pessimists said was impossible, and what planners said would require weeks of preparation. The human dimension of the crossing is equally remarkable. The soldiers who crossed that night, young men in canvas boats paddling through icy water into enemy territory, displayed extraordinary courage. Sergeant Warren Eames, who crossed in the first wave, later reflected, People ask me what I was thinking. Honestly, I was thinking, don't let the boat tip, don't fall in the water, keep paddling. It wasn't heroic thoughts. At the time, it was all about survival. But looking back, I realized we were part of something historic. We were the guys who broke Hitler's last line. As Private Donald Jones added years later, I told my grandson about crossing the Rhine. He asked if I was scared. I said terrified. He asked why I did it. I told him because my lieutenant got in the boat first, because the guy next to me was paddling, because quitting wasn't an option. That's what it came down to, not grand strategy, but not wanting to let down the men beside you. The crossing also revealed the importance of junior leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Ewell, whose battalion secured the initial bridgehead, later wrote, "General Patton gave the order, but we executed it. He trusted us to figure out the details, how to get the boats to the river, how to organize the assault waves, how to establish the perimeter. That trust made all the difference. We weren't just following orders, we were empowered to think and adapt." Churchill's continued fascination with Patton was evident in the weeks that followed. On March 30th, as Allied forces raced across Germany, Churchill wrote to Roosevelt, "The American army under Patton has performed magnificently. While I remain convinced that Montgomery's systematic approach serves important strategic purposes, I must acknowledge that Patton's ruthless exploitation of enemy weakness has shortened this war. The Germans fear him more than any other Allied commander, and fear is a powerful weapon." This admission was significant. Churchill, a loyal champion of British commanders, was acknowledging American military excellence, specifically the effectiveness of a general whose style was antithetical to British military tradition. In private conversations with his staff, Churchill was even more effusive. His private secretary, John Colville, recorded Churchill saying, "Patton is what we would have called in my day a thruster, a commander, who attacks not because the plan demands it, but because his instinct tells him the moment is right. We've become too scientific in our warfare, too dependent on perfect intelligence and overwhelming force. Patton reminds us that confusion, speed, and shock still have their place." The relationship between Churchill and Patton remained cordial, but complex. Churchill admired Patton's fighting spirit but remained wary of his political naivete and tendency toward controversial statements. In a letter to Eisenhower written in April 1945, Churchill noted, "General Patton is unquestionably a superb battlefield commander. I would trust him to execute any tactical operation with skill and determination. However, he requires careful handling off the battlefield, where his judgment is less reliable." Yet when Patton died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in a car accident, Churchill sent a heartfelt message to Patton's widow, Beatrice. "Your husband was a warrior in the truest sense, bold, decisive, and utterly committed to victory. His crossing of the Rhine will be remembered as long as men study warfare. Britain has lost a great friend and ally. The free world has lost a champion." Before we close, let's reflect on what this moment meant. The Rhine crossing was more than a tactical victory. It was a validation of a style of warfare that modern militaries had begun to question. In an age of massive bombardments, overwhelming logistics, and carefully coordinated offensives, Patton proved that speed, surprise, and individual initiative still mattered. Post-war military analysts spent years studying the operation. The U.S. Army War College published a comprehensive analysis in 1948 that concluded, "General Patton's Rhine crossing demonstrated that opportunistic warfare, when executed by competent forces under dynamic leadership, can achieve strategic results beyond those attainable through conventional methods. The operation should be studied not as an alternative to systematic planning, but as a complement to it, a reminder that flexibility and audacity must accompany even the most carefully laid plans." British military historian B. H. Littlehart, writing in 1950, placed Patton's crossing in historical context. Since Napoleon's campaigns, military theorists have debated the relative merits of methodical versus opportunistic warfare. Patton's Rhine crossing proved both have their place. Montgomery's careful, overwhelming assault secured a broad front with minimal risk. Patton's swift, unexpected assault exploited enemy weakness and accelerated the campaign. Neither approach was universally superior. Success depended on matching method to circumstance. What military historians universally acknowledge is the operation's impact on Allied morale and German psychology. The official U.S. Army history states, beyond its tactical success, Patton's Rhine crossing dealt a severe blow to German morale. It demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could no longer defend even Germany's most formidable natural barriers. The psychological impact hastened Germany's collapse. Churchill understood this implicitly. His praise for Patton wasn't just diplomatic courtesy. It was recognition that warfare has a psychological dimension as important as its physical one. By crossing the Rhine so swiftly, Patton convinced Germans that further resistance was futile, and convinced Allied soldiers that victory was inevitable. These beliefs became self-fulfilling prophecies. The final judgment on Patton's Rhine crossing comes from perhaps the most unlikely source, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. In a private conversation with military historian Forrest Pogue in 1947, recorded in Pogue's research notes, Montgomery admitted, "Patton's Rhine crossing was a stroke of genius. I would never have attempted it. Too risky, too hasty, too dependent on luck. But it worked brilliantly. That's the difference between Patton and me. I never took unnecessary risks. Patton never saw a risk as unnecessary if it promised victory. History will judge which approach was wiser. But I'll concede this. On March 22, 1945, Patton's way was exactly what the situation demanded. This may be the most honest assessment of all. Patton wasn't always right. His impulsiveness caused problems throughout his career. But at the Rhine in March 1945, facing a collapsing enemy and a fleeting opportunity, his instinct for aggressive action was precisely what the moment required. Churchill recognized this even as it highlighted the contrast with Britain's more methodical approach. The deeper meaning of Churchill's reaction lies in what it revealed about leadership and national character. Britain, exhausted by nearly 6 years of war, had become cautious, seeking to minimize casualties, avoid risks, and preserve what remained of its strength. America, more recently engaged and more confident in its resources, still believed in bold action and decisive victory. Churchill, spanning both worlds, a Victorian warrior who had witnessed the horrors of modern industrial warfare, understood both approaches. His praise for Patton was genuine but tinged with melancholy. He saw in Patton's crossing not just military success, but a passing of the torch. Britain's careful, systematic warfare had served its purpose, but the future belonged to those willing to take risks for a quick victory. In his war memoirs, published in 1953, Churchill devoted several pages to Patton's Rhine crossing. He wrote, "Among the many remarkable feats of arms I witnessed during the Second World War, few impressed me more than General Patton's assault crossing of the Rhine. With minimal preparation and maximum audacity, he achieved what conventional military wisdom said was impossible." As I stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 26, 1945, watching Patton's tanks roll into the German heartland, I knew that Nazi tyranny's days were numbered. In the end, what Churchill said when Patton crossed the Rhine mattered less than what he didn't say. He didn't claim credit for British planning. He didn't minimize the achievement. He didn't allow national pride to obscure military reality. Instead, he acknowledged excellence wherever he found it, even when it came from an ally whose methods differed from his own. This generosity of spirit, this ability to praise competitors and recognize merit regardless of source, was perhaps Churchill's greatest strength. It's why the Allied coalition held together despite friction between commanders. It's why British and American forces could work together despite different approaches. And it's why when Patton crossed the Rhine, Churchill's response was not jealousy or dismissal, but genuine admiration. If you enjoyed this story, consider liking the video and subscribing. Your support truly helps this channel continue. Thank you for watching, and I appreciate you being here.